I'm Greg Wheatley, and my guest today on Inside Wheaton is Dr. Jerry Root. Jerry has been a guest here before on Inside Wheaton. He is Associate Professor at Wheaton College, serves also as the Director of the Wheaton Evangelism Initiative, and we'll certainly want to talk more about that before we're finished with our conversation today. But Jerry, as always, it's good to welcome you back.
Greg, it's fun to be a friend of yours for a long time.
For a long time, and as a matter of fact, if people could only know, we've sat here for, 45 minutes before we ever started this official interview and talked. So.
And you probably had to get home to dinner.
I'm fine. No, the dinner will wait, so it's always good to talk to you. I want to start, Jerry. Anybody that knows you knows that you kind of eat, drink, sleep, breathe C.S. Lewis. At least that used to be true. Tell me that's still true.
No, it is still true. When I was a student in college, a person wisely said to me, you do not get an education in college, you just lay a foundation for one. And commencement means you will now commence your education by building on that foundation. Pick an author who will take you places and make that author your life study. So I picked C.S. Lewis. And what I discovered over the years, as I did my master's degree on him, master's thesis on him, my doctorate on him, and so on, and I've been teaching college and university courses on him now for 34 years, and I've lectured on him in 60 different colleges and universities in 8 different countries. I've never tired of him, but I think largely it's because he opens more than wardrobe doors. You can't read Lewis long without wanting to read the books that he's referring to. He stands shoulder to shoulder with his readers. He describes some book and you say, wow, I got to go read that. Yeah. And I go read them and my heart is thrilled by those books. Some of them I read and I go, I still don't know what he got out of that book. But he's not going to bore you if you're reading him well. Yeah. He'll take you everywhere. Reading him is a liberal arts education.
Do you think he'd be surprised if he were here today to see what's become of, there's almost a cult following in some circles around. Would that surprise Lewis?
Well, I think it's a shame about the fact that some people are almost cultic about him. I have some theories as to why that might be. But I know he would be surprised that his works have captured the imagination and have spread so widely and have been translated into many, many languages. And the reason why is because he thought himself, 3 years after he died, that all of his books would be out of print. Now, a lot of this has to do with a guy named Walter Hooper, who really did a lot to make sure that his writings stayed in print. And every generation of new readers comes upon his books and finds them very helpful in describing and defining and even depicting imaginatively what life in Christ might be like.
One of the things that Lewis believed strongly in, and actually, Jerry, I was just looking one of your books called The Soul of C.S. Lewis, I think co-authored with Wayne Martindale.
And Linda Washington.
As I was looking at that, I came across this idea, and I said, I've got to talk to Jerry about this. This idea that sometimes story or metaphor gets into places in us that regular reason just can't get at.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit and how that has meaning in our life.
Well, let me talk about it in 2 tracks. I'll talk about one, and I don't want to go too long for your audience, and then maybe we could segue into the other track. One has to do with the power of the story breaking through and touching our hearts, and the other one has to do with the mechanics of the story itself. So first off, the power. George MacDonald, an author who influenced Lewis deeply, said in his book, Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood, we do not have souls. We are souls. We have bodies. He's not a Gnostic. He talks about the immaterial and the material parts. But he says if you tell a child he has a soul, he thinks like anything he has, his books, his keys, his coat, he could lose it. He thinks that he goes to the grave and his soul goes off someplace else when he dies. MacDonald says tell the child he is a soul, he has a body. And when he dies, he goes to heaven and he leaves his body behind like clipped hair on the barbershop floor, for those of you that still have to get your hair cut, right? So as this is so, I have to say I've read a lot about the soul, and it's a complex topic, of course, but traditionally we would say the immaterial part of what it means to be human has a choosing part, the volition, It has a feeling part, the emotion, and it has a thinking part, the reason. And here we are at an academic institution, and I'm going to say to you, to keep it on the down low, that the reason is the weakest part of the soul, or the immaterial part. And the reason why is because if I make a bad choice, I will begin to guard that bad choice with all kinds of rationalizations and justifications. Aristotle called it akrasia or akrasia, the rationalizing of bad choice, and it leads to moral blindness. C.S. Lewis put it this way: continued disobedience to conscience makes conscience blind. Or Paul said we suppress truth in our unrighteousness. So if I make a bad choice, my reason doesn't say to my will, boy, Jerry, that was stupid. You keep going down that path, you're going to hurt yourself and you're going to hurt others. No, my reason instead begins to make these excuses and keep me morally blind. How do you get past this reason that is broken and compromised? And Lewis says that reason stands like watchful dragons before our soul, monitoring what gets to us. And he says sometimes story gets past the watchful dragons. And any Christian who's read the Bible knows that David, when he sinned so egregiously...
That's David and Nathan, isn't it?
Exactly. So Nathan is given the assignment by God to go tell David he's sinned egregiously. And David thinks he's getting away with it. And David's already gotten rid of one person who stood in his way of getting away with it, Uriah the Hittite. If I was Nathan, I would be very uncomfortable with that assignment. But Nathan's pretty cagey, and I think he's inspired by the Holy Spirit. He goes to David and he tells him a story. David's defenses are down. The story gets through. And all of a sudden he sees. And there's repentance. And there's transformation. So sometimes story has power like that.
And so you come up to the New Testament, you have the parables, right? Is that largely Jesus' purpose in the parables, I take it?
Well, I think so.
Although some people say they're to hide truth from those who won't see as well. Is that?
It could be so that their judgment is not quite as severe because they're just not going to get it. But I think largely the parables are given so that we can see by means of depiction. Also, there was a rhetorician at University of Chicago named Richard Weaver. He's most well known for his book Ideas Have Consequences. But he wrote a book called The Ethics of Rhetoric. All rhetoric essentially is persuasion, whether I want you to vote for my candidate in the next election or I want you to pass me the salt at the Thanksgiving dinner. I'm trying to say something that will get you to be moved to do something that I would hope you would do for me. So that means then if it's persuasion, I better be an ethical person. And he has outlined what persuasive and ethical arguments would be. And the top is the argument from definition, because I'm appealing to something that's there. I can't always get to a definition, though, because the word definition means of the finite. We define things by their limitation and their function. They're small enough I can wrap words around them and distinguish them from other things. How then do I talk about God? How do I define God, who's infinite? He breaks a category. So in those situations, Weaver would say, I have to revert to the argument from similitude, from simile, metaphor, figures of speech. The ancient or the medieval scholastic philosophers and theologians talked about discussion of God as the way of analogy, because it's the way we could best talk about these things. And I think when Jesus is using the parable, he knows that certainly there's got to be a story feature. And not only that, the story transcends its own time. It's not rooted in a culture that would mask because we don't have those particular cultural values or experiences.
We get it.
It's powerful.
Yeah. So bring it up, Jerry, to closer to contemporary time. Everybody's read a story that has sort of inexplicably moved them. Maybe you close that last page and you're weeping, and you really can't even. The story has gotten inside of you somehow. From a spiritual standpoint, how is that used? What is Lewis saying about that?
Well, I think Lewis sees that. First off, he says several places that we need to receive the literature. So I like to think critically about things, but I don't want to enter into the story thinking critically and thereby never getting the glory of the story.
You want the story to act on you.
Yeah, so I suspend belief and I receive the story rather than try to do things with the story. But it's the same thing with watching a movie, listening to a concert. You're a musician, a conductor, and so on. You want to receive it. And then if you find yourself particularly moved, go back and start your critical thinking at that place and begin to ask, why did that move me so much? And it will drive you back into the work of art, the literary piece, the music, the painting in the art museum and so on. I mean, how many times have you ever been in an art museum and you're walking along and you see something and you never notice it and it just catches you? I've done this where I've stood before paintings for for maybe a couple hours and gone back to museums to visit those paintings again because I was so moved by it. And you want to think why. And Lewis, I think, believes, yes, that there's something breaking through that speaks to us. It might not speak to another person, because they don't have our experience and so on. Frederick Buechner makes this comment that besides the Bible and the church, these very traditional ways that speak to us, God speaks to us most particularly and individually through what happens to us, through our own individual circumstances, and then God tailoring or directing his message to us through the events of our lives and breaks through, again, to get past those watchful dragons.
And then we're into this thing that it's a $64,000 word, but sacramental, aren't we? The view of life that says God is in all of this, rather than sort of relegating him to the didactic sermon on Sunday morning and trying to rationally figure out. Sacramental view says this is all of God, right?
Well, there's a way to look at sacraments in a formal way. The Reformed traditions, they have these ordinances. They believe they're commands, baptism and communion and so on. And then in the sacramental, the more formal liturgical churches, they have 7 sacraments. But the idea is that God is present in the sacrament, and he's mediating grace to us at some level. Now, I'm a Quaker. I'm a 5-point Calvinist Quaker. I'm the only one I know of in the world, so I'm probably wrong, which gives me good hermeneutical suspicion about my own views, which makes me listen to others because they're probably right and I'm wrong. But nevertheless, let me try and make the case. The Quakers don't stop at 7 sacraments. The Quakers say God is always present and he's always mediating grace. So like Brother Lawrence, I get to learn to practice his presence and begin to see the mediated grace coming to me from everything, even the painful experiences of my life. The cross would remind me of that. I think the most egregious event in human history was when the creatures mounted up against the Creator and they slew his Son. And yet he turned it on itself and made it the greatest demonstration of his love and grace for us. Even the bad things can have sacramental import for us. It's powerful.
Yeah. Let me take you back to story, the idea of story. We talked about the story kind of assaulting us. Does one come to mind? What's a story you've read that you perhaps would say that really did that to me?
Well, I have many, but there was a movie that I saw a while back called The Notebook. I saw it on an airplane. It's hard for me to recommend a movie I saw on an airplane because I don't know how sanitized it was for the airplane. But it's this love story. It's this old man. He goes to the rest home. He's reading stories, and the impression made is that this old man goes to the rest home and volunteers to read stories to people who have dementia. What a nice guy. The whole movie then is this old man reading the story of this old lady and the flashback of this love relationship, the story that he's telling. And it's about a boy and a girl. It's in the South. The girl's family are wealthy. They come to visit summer at this village where the boy lives, and they're wealthy enough they can do that for the summer. The boy is poor, modest means. He's educated. He has a high school degree. He likes the poetry of Walt Whitman, but she's been educated in all the right schools. She's very wealthy. Her family's intact. They're pretty pretentious, but they're intact. His family's unpretentious, and there's some sort of sadness because the mother never appears. We don't know if she died or she abandoned them and so on. There's so many things counting against this relationship working. They're pulled away from each other at the end of the summer. The boy says, "I'll write to you." The mother of the girl hears this. She's constantly intercepting the letters at the mailbox. The girl never gets them. She thinks he said he would write, he didn't. He thinks I write to her every day, she never writes back. And then World War II breaks out, and those circumstances pull the two further apart. Looks like this love relationship is never going to work out, and then all of a sudden it does. And it's at that moment in the movie you realize it's this old man reading this story to this old woman, and it's their story. And she has dementia, and every day he comes and tells her the story. Towards the end of the movie, they're having dinner in this place in the hospital, and it's a nice dinner. There's a candle burning, there's a rose in a bud vase, and there's a record player playing the music that had informed so much of their relationship. And this whole scene pulsates and reverberates the love of this man for this woman. And he finishes the story, and she says to him, "That's the most beautiful story I've ever heard in my life." And it sounds so familiar. And in that moment, cognition washes across her face. And she says, "It's our story, isn't it?" And he says, "Yes." And she says, "How much time do we have?" And he says, "Last time it was 5 minutes." She asks, "How are the children?" That's a question a mother would ask. He says, "They're fine. They came to see you today." She says, "Tell them I love them." He says, "I will." And while the music's playing, she says, "Hold me. Can we dance?" And they start dancing across that floor. And as quickly as she came into cognition, she falls out, finds herself in the arms of a stranger, starts screaming. The orderlies come in to sedate her. And James Garner, who plays the husband, is standing there weeping as he watches it all, biting his knuckle. And that's where I lost it in the story. It broke through past the watchful dragons. And I'm thinking to myself as I go back and revisit it, why did I weep so heavily at that moment? I'm a high T on the Myers-Briggs, but I was the feeler at that moment. Yeah. And what I realized, Greg, was this. It's all of our story. We're all part of a love story, and we live our lives at some level in dementia. And constantly God has put us in an environment where he's always telling us of his great love. And we just don't get it. And then there come those moments when we have cognition and we see his love breaking through. It overwhelms us so deeply. And then some little inconvenience occurs and we fall back into lack of cognition again. And when I saw James Garner's character biting his knuckle weeping, I said, that's a picture of the heart of God who continues to tell us how much he loves us. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about.
I saw that movie, and I have to tell you, I didn't get that. So thank you.
Well, maybe I'm wrong. I'm a 5-point Calvinist Quaker.
I think you're absolutely right. That's amazing. So good to talk about all of that. Before we're out of time, I want to ask you to maybe put on another hat here and talk about the fact that you are directing the Evangelism Initiative here. And I know you're excited about some of the things that are going on. Your heart is a heart of an evangelist, I think probably above everything else, and from knowing you. So tell me what's going on and what's got you excited here.
Well, I don't have the gift of evangelism, but it's a high value. I don't think we can know that we're loved by God and forgiven without wanting to have everybody else know that as well. And it seems to me every Christian should have this as a high value. And sometimes I go to churches and the pastors will say, well, Jerry, we're committed to evangelism and we like to encourage the people with the gift of evangelism to be engaged with it. I said, if that's really your value, I'd love to come preach at your church and tell all the people who don't have the gift of giving, they don't have to give anymore. And I don't want to go to the church where only the people with gift of mercy are showing mercy in a congregation. Right. My word, that'd be a cold place. But we have here at Wheaton, and it was something that was initiated by our two presidents, President Litvin, who's now retired, and President Riken, who's been a great champion of this, and our provost, Dr. Stan Jones. This desire to create an ethos of evangelism. Wheaton has a great history of evangelism, but we can't rest on our laurels and assume it's just going to reverberate or continue generationally. So we're being intentional about trying to create an ethos of evangelism where when a student's here, they will begin to take on this value, and wherever they go in their world, they'll plant Christ's flag and seek to bear responsibility to pray for and witness to the people in their world. And we've done this extracurricularly, but it looks like now we're on the threshold of maybe seeing it woven into the curriculum of our college. And Wheaton has been taking this evangelism initiative to the other Christian colleges and universities in America. And when we say, hey, Wheaton is really being serious about this, we think it'll encourage those other schools to do it as well. The CCCU schools graduate 50,000 students every year. That's 1 million in 20 years. We think we could change the country.
Yeah, that's exciting. Jerry, always good to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you so much. Dr. Jerry Root is Associate Professor and directs the Wheaton Evangelism Initiative. Stay tuned for more about that. If that sort of catches your ear and excites you, I think you'll be hearing more about that in the coming days as well. For Inside Wheaton, I'm Greg Wheaton.